Very much, Falula. It's wonderful to be here. We know Jane Austen as the author of 6 major novels, almost all of them published within 9 years, and there they all are, and we know what they are. Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion, Northanger Abbey. Now, each of these 6 novels is celebrated, I think, for social observation, wit, clarity, economy, and perhaps for one other thing. Jane Austen is a daughter of the Church of England. Her father is rector of the village of Steventon in Hampshire, preaching 1 sermon a week, sometimes more, although he didn't have to write them all. In adulthood, Jane herself would write several prayers, very nice prayers, and throughout her life she would be a keen reader of the moral essays of the celebrated Dr. Samuel Johnson, whom she calls my dear Dr. Johnson. And in each of these 6 major novels that we can find a strong moral sense. Virtue is rewarded, vice is punished, sometimes harshly, well, sometimes not so harshly, but usually the good girl gets the good man, and quite a lot else in the case of Elizabeth Bennet, actually. The bad girl gets shame and disgrace, as does the mad bad man, but nobody minds that much about him. Yes, if we could have the lights out. Thank you, Paul. But now, Jane Austen was not the only writer in her family. Her mother wrote verses. Her brother was considered the poet of the family, her elder brother James. She was one of a number of writers, and so she was writing from a very early age. She'd always wanted to be a writer, and between the ages of 11 and 17 she'd been writing short stories and novels, and a few plays, bits of plays in which the heroines are anything but prim and proper, unlike somebody else we meet in Pride and Prejudice, Charlotte Lucas, seen here with the awful clergyman, Mr. Collins, whom she will in fact snap up. Among the heroines of the young Jane Austen are some bad apples. They steal, they murder, they go to prison, they throw their babies out of windows, they get roaring drunk, and with only very few exceptions, they do get away with it. Later, I will read you one of these stories in its entirety. Grown-up Jane will write for publication and for money. Young Jane writes to entertain her family and, of course, herself. Now, in recent years, this portrait has been almost certainly identified as being the young Jane Austen. It was commissioned by her wealthy uncle Frank and passed down in a branch of the family, the Rice family, related to the Austens. Now, for years, and I think they haven't yet got round to it, the National Portrait Gallery deny that this portrait can be Jane on the reasonable grounds that this Regency dress didn't appear in England until about 1805, when Jane would have been in her 30s. But with digital photography, things change. Her name is said to have been seen on the back together with the artist Ozias Humphrey. Now, I haven't seen it with my own eyes, and until I do that, I can't be sure. But something else. There were a few high-waisted dresses worn early in England, brought from Paris, where the fashion had started, and Jane's cousin Eliza, who she adored, could well have brought her such a dress a little bit early in fashionable white. In Mansfield Park, her 3rd novel, which I'm going to touch upon quite a bit, Jane Austen says this: children of the same family have means of enjoyment in their power that no later connections can supply. It must be by a long, unnatural estrangement if they are ever entirely outlived. Youngest but one of 5 brothers and a sister, Jane would never outlive such early connections, and in adulthood she would be much loved by nephews and nieces for her sense of fun, among other things. Now, this is a family game battledore and shuttlecock, depicted here by a woman 15 years younger than Jane Austen, the amateur watercolourist Miss Diana Sperling, who lived in Essex, in the country, her country life, just a few years after Jane was living in Hampshire. And we'll see, to me, these watercolours by Diana Sperling represent to perfection the characters in an Austen novel. So we will be seeing a few of them as we go along. It has been suggested by more than one biographer that Jane Austen could have modelled one particular heroine on herself, Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, who was fond of all boys' plays, preferring cricket to playing with dolls or keeping a pet dormouse or canary. Catherine was noisy and wild and loved nothing so well in the world as rolling down the green slope at the back of the house. Well, there was a green slope to roll down at the back of the house where Jane was born, which we will see very shortly, though we won't see the slope because it's at the back. But here is just one other picture from this book of watercolours by Miss Diana Sperling. It's called Mrs. Hurst Dancing, Scenes from Regency Life. Mrs. Hurst is that lady on the left, dancing merrily away without a partner. Not a bad image of Jane Austen. Cassandra and Jane would often go to informal country hops such as this. But now, here is another amateur artist, Jane's niece Anna, older daughter of Jane's eldest brother James. And here is the rectory where Jane was born on December the 16th, 1775, very cold winter, to George and Cassandra Austin, a country clergyman and classics teacher, and his wife. Here, and at another nearby rectory in the village of Dean, all the children were born. James, the eldest, George, who is autistic and has to be sent away and supported, Edward, Henry, Cassandra, Frank, 1 year older than Jane, then 4 years after her, her baby brother, Charles. Here, in this rectory, at a nice room at the back overlooking the garden, Father prepares his sermons and also his lessons for the young male pupils who live up in the attic to make a bit of money. They live right up there in those tiny little rooms. Orphaned at an early age, Jane's father never has a penny, so he must do whatever he can, and very sensibly, at the other end of the village, he runs a small farm that is called Cheesedown Farm to provide fresh food, and so his family is almost self-sufficient. And this brings us back to Diana Sperling. Like her family in Essex, the Austens are country people, through and through. The boys grow up to hunt and shoot and fish, and as children, even the two girls would almost certainly be roped in for haymaking, unlike those young people there standing uselessly and idly by. They could well have found themselves trying to tame donkeys, like the young people in this picture by Diana Sperling. In adulthood, Jane writes a little poem to her older brother Frank, 1 year older, with whom she must have played. She remembers how brave he was, how nothing frightened him except a donkey's awful bray. Little Frank, we'll meet him tomorrow at length. He grows up to have a very successful career at sea. As a child, besides being frightened of a donkey, he had a pony, he calls it Squirrel, and his mother makes him a hunting coat, extraordinarily, made out of her old wedding dress, which was made of red wool. A red wool travelling dress it was she wore at her wedding. Economy very firmly in mind, as it always is with the Austens. This is the only surviving portrait of Cassandra Austin, Jane's mother. In later years, there's nothing of her when young, not very flattering, one would think, but in fact she was rather proud of that nose, indicating noble birth and her relationship to the Dukes of Chandos. She also has distinguished academic connections. One uncle, Theophilus Lee, a great wit is for years and years Master of Balliol College, Oxford. And Mrs. Austen is a strong character. She passes down to her daughters many of her views, including strong suspicions of London. It is a sad place. There is no time to do your duty there to God or man. And in her daughter's novel, city folk who arrive in the country are generally up to no good. From childhood, Jane's mother has written verses for fun. She continues to do so throughout her busy married life. And I shall now read you a little poem by Mrs. Austen, or I'll read you some of it anyway, on the subject of getting out of bed. There was a sort of family game with the Austens. You have to write a poem, and all the words, all the ends of the lines have got to rhyme with a chosen word. In this case, the word was rose. Everything has to rhyme with a rose. So here's a picture of Mrs. Austen with a nice rose. This morning I woke from a quiet repose. I first rubbed my eyes and I next blew my nose. With my stockings and shoes I then covered my toes and proceeded to put on the rest of my clothes. That's a bit of a cheat. I employed myself next in repairing my hose. My work being done, I looked through the windows, and with pleasure beheld all the bucks and the does, the cows and the bullocks, the wethers and ewes. To the library each morn all the family goes, so I went with the rest, though I felt rather froze. My flesh is much warmer, my blood freer flows, when I work in the garden with rakes and with hoes. And Mrs. Austen is a keen gardener, and she's particularly interested in growing potatoes. Now here's Jane's father, George. Known, again, we have no picture of him in youth. In youth, he was known as the handsome proctor, and he seems to have been a lovely man, cultivated and kindly, educated at Oxford on a scholarship which he'd needed, himself an orphan. Possibly he appreciates family life all the more for that. There's no record of him ever having a nasty temper. He enjoys reading this new literary form of the novel, of which, as a clergyman, he might well have disapproved. He lets his daughters read Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, which has got some saucy bits in it. And he even approves of Jane's somewhat anarchic early writings. And he himself is a good speaker, both at church and at home. He can read aloud to his family, a talent which he passes on to his younger daughter. We know this from her niece, Caroline, who reports that hearing Aunt Jane read aloud from Fanny Burney's Evelina was as good as being at the play. That's quite a compliment. And in later years, nephews and nieces remember that Aunts Cassandra and Jane, although they're rather shabby, they're always neat. And what was really impressive about them, they're really very articulate. Their most casual sentences contrive balance and flow. Very good. This is Jane's own childhood copy of a children's book well known in her day, Goody Two Shoes, about a little girl learning to read. Down on the right, you see the alphabet being spelled out. Young Jane apparently coloured the pictures herself and wrote her name at the top of the page on the left. We don't know at what age. When she was 7 and Cassandra 9.5, Cassandra was sent to boarding school, almost certainly for financial reasons, to make room for more scholars in the attic. And the two were already very close, which they'd always be, and Jane insists on accompanying her sister to boarding school. And their mother says that if Cassandra was going to have her head cut off, Jane would insist on having hers cut off too. They go to 2 different schools in 5 years, nearly dying of typhoid in one of them in Southampton, and a cousin does in fact die. The second school is romantically situated here in the ruins of Reading Abbey in Berkshire, one of many which had been destroyed by King Henry VIII. Young Jane is fascinated by English history, and aged 15, home now from boarding school, she writes her own history of England by a partial, prejudiced and ignorant historian. She dedicates it to Cassandra, and Cassandra's artistic. She illustrates it, depicting our kings and queens of 300 or 400 years ago wearing contemporary dress. Here's Henry VI, very religious man, so Cassandra dresses him as a clergyman like her own father, quite right. Young Jane has a low opinion of King Henry VI. She's very critical. I cannot say much for this king's sense. I suppose you know all about the wars between him and the Duke of York, who was on the right side. If you do not, you had better read some other history, for in this I mean only to show my hatred for all those people who do not agree with me and not to give information. She doesn't think much of King Henry VII, neither does Cassandra, quite clearly. And as for King Henry VII's granddaughter, well, the destroyer of all comfort, writes Jane, the betrayer of trust, the murderess of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, of whom the Austen girls quite clearly approve. A family dinner we have now by Diana Sperling again. On the left we have a young man arriving late, looking very important with his luggage. And I like that there's a bird somewhere taking part in dinner. Very nice. She's so lucky in having these older brothers. They all lead exciting lives at one point or another, and they all influence her. When she is 11, her first and third brothers, James and Henry, they're both at Oxford. They start their own magazine, and they name it after Samuel Johnson's The Rambler. They mockingly call it The Loiterer. And someone contributes articles to The Loiterer under the nom de plume of Sophia Sentiment. It is thought to be Jane, but we're not quite sure. When they come home, here in the dining room like this, they start putting on amateur drama. First here and then expanding into a neighbouring barn, and aged 12, young Jane plays the part of Tom Thumb in Henry Fielding's pantomime of that name. So that's James and Henry. Now we'll see the second brother, not counting poor George, in silhouette as the little boy on the left, as if aged 7. Throughout Jane's lifetime, her family have great trouble making ends meet. When Edward was about this age, he charmed this wealthy aunt, Mrs. Knight, who had no children. And a few years later, when Edward's 15, they adopt him formally. He becomes Edward Austen Knight. There's his mother pointing at Mrs. Knight, telling her son, yes, it's okay to go to her. And there's Mr. Knight over there. Yes, and it all worked out very well. He becomes Edward Austen Knight. He inherits not one but 2 fine country estates, Godmersham, beautiful place in Kent, and Chawton in Hampshire. He remains close to his birth family, and Cassandra and Jane, over the years, they go and visit him, and they help to look after his 11 children. At Godmersham, Jane writes her first version of Sense and Sensibility, and surely the sight of such glorious places might have got her thinking of Mr. Darcy and his Yorkshire estate, Pemberley. Now, another source of inspiration comes from the lives of her 2 younger brothers, Frank and Charles, but we will go into that more tomorrow afternoon. They both go into the Navy and serve in the Navy most of their lives. Fighting for the dunghill is Jack Tar, the English sailor settling Napoleon, by James Gilray. Jane is 14 years old when the French Revolution breaks out. When she is 18, the King of France goes to the guillotine. Most of her life, almost all of it, England and France are at war. When she is 19, her own family has all too close experience of the horrors of France. Now this is her cousin Eliza, who could well have given her that white dress. 14 years older than she, witty, amusing, Jane adores her, and she could well have based some heroines upon her. Eliza has been born in India. She is the only child of George Austen, Jane's father's older sister, Philadelphia, an orphan like him, who had first been apprenticed to a hat maker and then, at her own request, sent out to India to find a husband on what was called the fishing fleet. And she finds a husband. However, Eliza's father was thought to be, and still nobody knows, not the army surgeon Saul Hancock, who Philadelphia marries, but the Governor-General of India, Warren Hastings, who becomes her godfather and who gives her great presents of money. So, as a young woman, just before the Revolution, Eliza can visit fashionable Paris with her mother. She can learn French, she can be very impressive, she can marry a French count, which she does, and write glorious letters to her cousins in England. Very influential on Jane. She visits, she plays the lead in their little barn theatre, but all the boys fall in love with her. When the Revolution breaks up, she is in Paris. They don't hear from her for a bit. Suddenly, she does turn up. Having lost a child she was carrying, she has one older boy, a little boy called Hastings, by the way. Her husband has gone to the guillotine. She has only just escaped with her own life. Jane is just 19 and would always fear and distrust France. Eliza would get over this tragedy rather quickly, go on flirting with Jane's brothers, and finally marry the third one, Henry, who's always fancied her. With two brothers at Oxford, Jane grows up very interested in trends and fashions of the day, including that of the picturesque, the cultivated appreciation of landscape as the possible subject for a picture. Lake Windermere, by the clergyman and artist William Gilpin, who had started this trend. From an early age, she likes drawings and paintings such as this on the subject of the picturesque. In Northanger Abbey, she pokes fun at this fashionable cult. But in her own life, she responds all right to the beauty of the countryside, and she reflects upon it, and she puts reflections into the mouth of young Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. Every time I come into this shrubbery, says Fanny, I am struck with its growth and beauty. 3 years ago, this was nothing but a rough hedgerow along the upper side of the field, never thought of as anything or capable of becoming anything, and now it is converted into a walk, and it would be difficult to say whether most valuable as a convenience or an ornament, and perhaps in another 3 years we shall be almost forgetting what it was before. How wonderful, how very wonderful the operations of time and the changes of the human mind. One cannot fix one's eyes upon the commonest natural production, says Fanny, without finding food for a rambling fancy. However, as we all know, the countryside is by no means idyllic if one is wearing the wrong shoes. Diana Sperling knows this. Here, everyone is slipping about. The girls are carrying their shoes in a bag because there is dinner waiting at a neighbour's house. And in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet shocks the Bingleys by turning up with 6 inches of mud on her skirt. Shoes of that period were no good. Like nobody had yet invented the Wellington boot. It was coming along soon, but it hasn't come yet. All you've got is clogs. That is to say, overshoes with wooden soles supported by an iron frame. Really very down market. In later life, Cassandra and Jane would more or less live in clogs, embarrassing their nephews and nieces. Safely back indoors, dancing is a great sport of the day, and here a sprightly mother teaches her son to dance. He must learn to dance, for the ballroom is a place of much importance in the life of a small country town. And here, briefly, a class of rather grim-faced young women receive a lesson in the correct use of the fan. The ballroom is a place to work. It is a serious place, a place where young women can meet young men. To make a good marriage is to gain protection from a husband or from a grown-up son, even though any money a woman brings to a marriage belongs to her husband until round about 1876, and the way to the marriage market is through the ballroom. In Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen sets important scenes in ballrooms among characters like this. Everyone's smiling politely, but there's a bit of backstabbing going on here, I think. Well, in a ballroom, aged 21, Jane meets a young man from Ireland studying for the law. He is clever, he is funny, and he looks like this. They dance together several times. Jane writes likely about Tom Lefroy, but she writes rather often. And Cassandra, who's away at the time, she knows about Tom Lefroy. He has no money, and what's more, he has 4 unmarried sisters. He cannot marry himself to suit himself. He must do it for his family. Jane takes the hint. She writes back likely about Tom Lefroy, who soon disappears back to Ireland, and she never sees him again. Over the next few years, both she and her father inquire after Tom from his aunt, Anne Lefroy, a local and a great friend. But he never comes back. He stays in Ireland, he marries somebody rich, and he ends up as Lord Chief Justice. Many years later, he would say, when asked, that yes, he had once been in love with Jane Austen, but it was, he says, a boy's love. Heaven knows what one makes of that. Well, not long after saying goodbye to him, she embarks on the first draft of Sense and Sensibility, currently called Eleanor and Marianne. And whatever the experience was, she could well have made use of it when writing about Marianne Dashwood and her heartbreak over the betrayer Willoughby. But we're in the realm of speculation here, as in so much of Jane Austen, because after her death, Cassandra burns a great many of her letters. She leaves some to their niece Fanny, and Fanny will burn the rest, including almost all from this period. The Lending Library by the artist Isaac Cruikshank. Young ladies are borrowing novels or romances from the bottom shelf, which is, as you see, empty. It says, what does it say? Now, the top shelf is utterly full. Nothing has been taken out. And what does it say? It says sermons. Now, that young lady, looking a bit dazed, is walking away in a happy dream with something escapist under her arm, no doubt, as indeed there are a great many novels of that kind. But there are a few other novels, first written, no doubt influenced by Johnson, by the Nottingham printer Samuel Richardson, who wrote his novel Pamela about a young servant girl who can read and write and can fend off the advances of our young employer. He wrote that for the benefit of servant girls. Fanny Burney was influenced by Richardson. She too would write novels for the benefit of young women entering society, novels with realism and humour and a strong moral tone. And Fanny Burney would be a strong influence on Jane Austen. Aged 21, she is engaged on early drafts of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. She has close at hand something for which I think any author would almost give some small part of their body, and that is a trusted critic and reader with whom they share a bed. Her sister, seen here in silhouette. Oh no, there's Fanny Burney, I forgot about that. There she is. And this is Cassandra. Now, age 20, Cassandra, says Jane, is the finest comic letter writer of the age. That is quite something. But again, we don't know. We can't read any of Cassandra's letters. She burnt almost all of hers, even more of her own than she burnt of Jane's. Very frustrating. But Cassandra has been the practical one. When their mother gets too old to manage the house, Cassandra takes it over. Cassandra visits the poor, not Jane. Cassandra, says the family, has a temper that's always under control. Jane, said the family, has a temper that never needs control. Aged 20, Cassandra has become engaged to one of her father's ex-pupils, a young man called Thomas Fole, who she's known from childhood, but they're much too poor to marry, they can't, and so they keep the engagement a secret. Whose idea that was, we do not know. And while waiting for a vacant post in England, he's a clergyman, like so many of the Austen men, he takes work as an army chaplain in the West Indies, on the island of San Domingo, and there 2 years later, Thomas Fole catches yellow fever and dies and is buried at sea. His well-meaning patron, Lord Craven, who's a distant relative, would say that if only he'd known that the young man was engaged, he would not have sent him to such a dangerous part of the world. Cassandra takes the news stoically, but never looks at another man, and goes into middle-aged caps very early. The city of Bath in the West Country, seen from the surrounding hills, in the year 1800, the Reverend George Austen makes a decision, rather suddenly, to retire from the church and give the rectory to his eldest son, James, who's a vicar like himself and has been pushing for this rather, and move with wife and daughters to the city of Bath. There is a story that on hearing this sudden, unwelcome news, that Jane actually fainted on the kitchen floor. Well, what is certain is she was working on her early novel in letter form, Lady Susan, which is a wonderful story, and she cannot have welcomed the disruption. However, Bath is where her parents had met and fallen in love and been married. Cassandra is nearly 28 now, Jane 25. Their parents must have hoped to find husbands for their daughters before it was too late here in this lively city. Two visitors promenading on Norfolk Terrace just a few years after Jane's arrival. Though past its heyday, which had been the middle of the 18th century, Bath is still fashionable and fun. And Jane would come to know it well. She would set Northanger Abbey there. She would set Persuasion there. These promenaders might well be on their way to a masquerade at the famous assembly rooms. Earlier in the day, they would have visited the pump room to drink the waters which tasted horrible for their health, to meet with company and to have a good look at their clothes. That's where you learn what to wear in Bath. How can you know what to wear before fashion magazines, let alone high street shops? In Northanger Abbey, James says that Mr. Allen, after drinking his glass of water, joined the gentlemen to talk over the politics of the day and compare the accounts of their newspapers, while the ladies walked about together, noticing every new face and nearly every new bonnet in the room. A Bath milliner's shop. Two ladies having great fun selecting ribbons, assisted by a charming young salesman, and behind him all the different fabrics on offer. Plain modes, Prussian front, striped Dorcas, and something rather important up here, bosom friend. A little bit of padding. With little money to spend on costume, Jane and Cassandra have to make do by decorating their bonnets to make them look new with feathers and flowers and a ribbon. Next week, writes Jane, I shall begin work upon my hat, upon which my principal hopes of happiness depend. Flowers are much worn this spring on hats, and fruit is still more the thing. Elizabeth, that's her sister-in-law, Edward's wife, Elizabeth has a bunch of strawberries hanging from the side of her new bonnet, and I have seen grapes, cherries, plums and apricots, similarly adorning brims. There are likewise almonds and raisins at the grocer's, but I've never seen any of them on hats. Now, this is one of many attempts to soften the famously sharp, unfinished sketch by Cassandra from 1810. It's now in the National Portrait Gallery, and here are the two together. Now, for years, people resisted believing that this was a true likeness of Jane Austen. And there are plenty of attempts to soften it. We'll see one or two more a bit later on. But you know, would Cassandra have invented that sharp, almost fierce look? Would she have made it up? I do not think so. Cassandra knew and loved her sister, and she would not have invented it or exaggerated it, and this is Jane Austen. And Jane writes of a social evening. There were very few beauties here tonight, and such as there were not very handsome. Mrs. Blunt was much admired. She appeared as she did last September, with the same broad face, white shoes, pink husband, and fat neck. She's pretty sharp. Mrs. Hall of Sherborne was brought to bed yesterday of a dead child some weeks before she expected, owing to a fright. I suppose she happened unawares to look at her husband. Now, not long ago in the New York Review of Books, I came across a somewhat shocking to Austenites, exceedingly ugly and totally horrible cartoon, which I'm now going to show you, but only briefly. But from time to time, I think that artist may have had a valid point. However, back to a more romantic image from the rear by Cassandra. Long after Jane's death, when Cassandra was old lady, she tells a niece that one summer, during the 5 years at Bath, on holiday at the seaside, Jane met a young man with whom she fell seriously in love, a curate, naturally. Everyone liked him, even Cassandra, who was fussy. He went away promising to return, well, instead of which the following summer the family received news of his sad death. And that's all we know. We don't know if it's true. One beady biographer, David Noakes, has cast doubt on the whole thing, thinks Cassandra made it up. We will never know. However, we know that on December the 2nd, 1802, here in this rather nice house, that Jane Austen received a proposal of marriage, which she did, from the young owner of this house, Mr. Harris Bigwither, whose older sisters are Jane's friends. Well, she is now 26. As her heroine Emma will say a few years later, a single woman with a narrow income must be a ridiculous, disagreeable old maid, the proper sport of boys and girls. Well, here she could be mistress of a great house, she could be comfortable, she could be respected. And that evening she accepts Mr. Harris Bigwither. Early the next morning, after a sleepless night, she tells him she's completely changed her mind, and she leaves the house in a great hurry, very distressed, with Cassandra. Maybe she can't forget the young man at the seaside, maybe she couldn't forget Tom Lefroy, or maybe she just couldn't face the prospect of Mr. Harris Bigwither, who was 8 years younger than she, terribly shy, and had a terrible stammer. We do not know, we cannot stop guessing. A street leading to a fashionable square recently built, Laura Place, where the Austens could never afford to live. Jane's childhood had been really rather happy. The years in Bath are marked by events that cast shadows, not least, at last, the devastating sudden death of her beloved father. George Austen had always been a great support to his daughter. He had tried to get First Impressions, The Future Pride and Prejudice, published. He'd done everything he could. And he probably went on supporting her. At the time of his death, Jane is trying to write something else, an unfinished thing called The Watsons, which she would never finish. Her father's death stopped her in her tracks. With him goes his pension, the family income. Mrs. Austen, Cassandra and Jane must leave fashionable Bath as soon as possible and find somewhere cheaper. For 12 years now, the war with France has been going on, something the Austens can never forget for a moment, with 2 boys at sea. On the south coast, invasion is expected, and Brother Frank is helping to defend the walled city of Southampton. He has a house in the city. He invites his mother and sister to come and stay. And here Jane starts writing again, a novel called Catherine, later Northanger Abbey. Finds a publisher through Brother Henry, who pays her £10, promised to publish it, and never does. Soon, the little family is offered a more permanent home by a very grand gentleman we've met as a little boy. This is Brother Edward, who was adopted as a child by wealthy relations, had grown up into a life of wonderful country pursuits, had married a beautiful wife. They had 10 children. Elizabeth was always very healthy. Suddenly, on the birth of the 11th, she falls sick and dies. Edward would never marry again. His sisters must come and help him out a lot. And his eldest daughter, Fanny, becomes Jane Austen's favourite niece, almost a sister, and years later incur the fury of later biographers by destroying a great many of her aunt's letters. Nobody still to this day can understand. But now, I love this picture. It's Edward's great house at Chawton in Hampshire. It's by a local artist from earlier in the century. This is one of his grand houses, the other one's in Kent. And he offers his mother and sisters not this grand house, but a little one, nearby, down the road, and there they would live for the next 8 years, which see the flowering of Jane Austen's talent. And they see also days filled with busy domestic life in house and garden. All the Austen women love gardens. Cassandra and Jane, they grow flowers and they grow fruit, strawberries, gooseberries, apricots, plums. They make wine and they drink it. And Mrs. Austen keeps going with the potatoes and other vegetables. They might have got down, they have a nice time. They might have got down, I can't resist showing this, papering the saloon, a new method of decoration. On the other hand, wallpaper was a little bit expensive and very new, so they might not have done that. But they did, we know, get busy with their needles, especially Jane, who was very good with her fingers and enjoyed needlework. A nephew writes years after her death that her satin stitch, here it is, might almost have put a sewing machine to shame. Well, besides that, now settled, this is the living room at Chawton, what's now Jane Austen's house, as it is today, the only place where there is any room for her to write. She has no privacy. Not that she needs it from the family. She's always written. Nobody takes any notice, but she doesn't like strangers seeing it. There is a creaking door warning her when someone is coming. She would then quickly hide her papers under a useful new invention, blotting paper. In this room, too, stood her new piano, which she plays every morning before breakfast. Simple little things. I will practice country dances so that we may have some amusement for our nephews and nieces. A favourite niece is Caroline, the youngest daughter of older brother James, who says this: "As a child, I was always following Aunt Jane in the house and out of it. She seemed to love you, and you loved her in return." A yet greater softening of that Cassandra portrait. Aunt Jane apparently tells long, detailed fairy stories, but she doesn't write them down. And she likes dressing up children with her own clothes from her own wardrobe, and they love that. And here is Fanny, Portrayed by Cassandra, writing a letter, Edward's motherless eldest daughter. She could be writing a letter to Aunt Jane. She wrote a number of letters to Aunt Jane, asking advice about her love life, and receiving nice letters back, such as this: "My dearest niece, what delightful letters you have just sent. You can hardly think what a pleasure it is to me to have such a thorough picture of your heart. Oh, what a loss it will be when you are married. But married you must be, for single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor. I can see you at the altar. I do not wish the match without a great deal of love on his side. Do not be in a hurry. Depend upon it, the right man will come at last. You will, in the course of the next 2 or 3 years, meet with somebody who will so completely attach you, you will feel you never really loved before. And by not beginning the business of mothering quite so early in life, you will be young in constitution, spirits, figure, and countenance." Well, that's rather leaping ahead, because that letter was written in March 1817, the last year of Jane's life. In the preceding 6 years, Fanny's aunt has embarked on a marathon of hard work. She's reworked her first 2 novels, now entitled Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. She has completed 3 more, Mansfield Park, Persuasion, with the help of brother Henry, currently a banker. She has at last found a London publisher for Sense and Sensibility. It's published anonymously, as everything is in her lifetime. It earns her £140, the first money she's ever earned, and by God she wants more. And then this one doesn't make quite as much, but it is an instant hit. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, illustrated by Hugh Thompson. And it is this book which will bring Jane on it. There's another one. She is tolerable. And it's this book that brings Jane on trips to see London to see her publishers. "Here I am in this scene of dissipation and vice, Sloane Street," she writes, staying with brother Henry. She takes her nephews and nieces to Vauxhall, popular pleasure gardens in London. She goes to an art exhibition at the old Royal Academy in the Strand. She goes to buy dress materials in a draper's shop, writing back to Cassandra in Chawton that "I have been ruining myself on black ribbon. I hope when you come we shall both be tempted." And here's the art exhibition. At an art exhibition, perhaps like this, she looks to see if she can find any characters in her novels. She's looking for the Bennet girls at an art exhibition, and she finds a portrait of a young woman in green, and that makes her think of Jane Bennet. I always imagined green would be a favourite colour with her. And she pictures Elizabeth in yellow. She sees no young woman in yellow, and so she imagines that Mr. Darcy is too possessive to be willing of any portrait of his wife to be seen in public. And she goes to bookshops like this enormous one in North London, which is called the Temple of the Muses, wanting to know how her 2 published books are doing. Alas, people are more willing to praise than to buy, she says. Still, I like praise very well, though I also like what they call pewter, money. Now, here's somebody else who's fond of pewter, a man of whom Jane thoroughly disapproves, as do most women of the time, the future King George of England. He's very self-indulgent, very extravagant, and horrible to his wife, Princess Caroline, who is no angel, Princess Caroline. And yet, says Jane Austen, I will support the princess as long as I can, because she is a woman and because I hate her husband. When she gets a letter saying how much the princess enjoyed Pride and Prejudice and will she please dedicate her next novel, well, she has to do it. And this would do the sales of Emma no harm at all. A letter written by Jane Austen 12 years ago under a false name. Here it is, Mrs. Ashton Dennis. It was under this name that while living in Southampton, she'd managed to sell a novel to a Mr. Crosby, the publisher. He bought it, gave her £10, neglected it. For years it had lain in his office gathering dust. She wants it back, but she doesn't want him to know that it's by the very successful author of Pride and Prejudice. Henry, brother Henry, very bright, writes him a cunning letter, also under a false name. Dear Mr. Crosby, I am the literary agent of Mrs. Ashton Dennis. I understand you have a manuscript. I would like it back. I enclose £10, the sum you originally paid, and it comes straight back. And nobody knows. It was Northanger Abbey. No one knows how Mr. Crosby felt when he found it was by the author of Pride and Prejudice. Now, this is from 1810, this Cassandra portrait again. There is no portrait of Jane in 1816, perhaps just as well, by which time she's suffering from a rare kind of tuberculosis which affects the kidneys. It can be treated very easily today with steroids. There are money problems too. Her brother Henry's bank has collapsed, and that really upsets her. She loses a bit of money, but she feels ashamed of being upset. She blames it on her illness. It's not a good year, 1816. I have not been well for many weeks. I've had a good deal of fever at times, but I'm better now and recovering my looks a little. They have been black and white and every wrong colour. I must not depend upon being ever very blooming again. Sickness is a dangerous indulgence at my time of life. She's 40. She is writing her last novel, Sanditon, which she will never complete. 3 brothers live nearby, and they visit her very, very often, each of them so affectionate. And for my sister, words must fail me in any attempt to describe what a nurse she has been. If I live to be an old woman, I must expect to wish I had died now, blessed in the tenderness of such a family, before outliving either them or their affection. Typical bit of Austen black realism. Well, in May 1817, 2 months after she wrote that nice letter to Fanny, the sisters move to the city of Winchester to live in this house near the doctor, and there, 3 months later, Jane dies in her sister's arms. According to the custom of the day, women are not allowed at funerals. Cassandra is left in the house alone. Through strings pulled by brother Henry, Jane was buried in Winchester Cathedral. She wasn't famous, nobody had heard of her, but there she is. But in every way, these 2 women, Cassandra and Jane, are daughters of the Church of England, a church which during their lifetimes is becoming increasingly strong. Their father had been a churchman, 2 of their brothers were, and their church, without any doubt, gives them strength for Jane to face her illness, and strength for Cassandra too to face the remaining 28 years of her life, more or less alone. Last picture by Diana Sperling, her own mother, alone in the house. Perhaps it can stand briefly for Cassandra, who writes most beautifully of Jane that she was the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself. Well, family affection was so important to Jane that it's almost fortunate that she never outlived it. But as a writer, families at odds are rather better value. Where are we? Oh, yes, I can do this. I'm going to read you a brief novel in letter form by Jane Austen, age 16. It is called The 3 Sisters. It has nothing whatever to do with Anton Chekhov. And we will see at the same time a few contemporary plates like this from the Gallery of Fashion, the first fashion magazine at the end of the 18th century to use colour. And here we are. Letter, the three sisters, letter the first, Miss Mary's